Have you ever been called useless? Have you ever heard someone say that you're good for nothing, that you'll never be anyone, that you're just taking up space? Maybe it was a parent, a teacher, a boss, or even someone you loved. And even if you try to forget, those words stayed etched in your mind like invisible scars. You carry that weight every day, trying to prove they were wrong. But deep down, part of you still believes that maybe they were right, that maybe you really aren't good enough for anything. This is the story of a man who heard the word useless so many times that it became his name. His father said it, his teachers said it, his co-workers said it. At 40 years old, he was a walking failure. At least that's what everyone thought. He worked as an assistant in a mechanic's shop, earning almost nothing, living in a rented room with no family, no friends, no future. Until one day, a broken car and an unexpected customer revealed something he had never known about himself, something that changed not only his life, but the way he understood his own worth. Stay with me until the end, because this story can completely transform the way you see yourself. It doesn't matter how many times you've been told you're useless. It doesn't matter how many doors have been slammed in your face. What others say about you does not define who you are. It only defines what they are capable of seeing, and sometimes the most valuable people are exactly the ones the entire world underestimated. Maybe you are one of those people, and maybe it's time to finally discover your true value. In an industrial city in the state of Ohio, there lived a man named Edward. At 40 years old, he worked as an assistant in a small mechanics shop on the outskirts of Cleveland. His job was simple: clean the floor, organize tools, fetch parts, make coffee. Tasks that anyone could do. Tasks that required no talent, intelligence, or skill. At least that's what everyone said. Edward earned just enough to pay the rent on a small room in a rundown boarding house and buy cheap food at the supermarket. There was nothing left over. There was never anything left over. Edward was a man of few words, not because he was shy, but because he had learned early on that his words didn't matter. As a child, his father, a violent alcoholic, had the habit of calling him useless every time he drank. "You're useless, boy, just like your mother who ran away. You're good for nothing." Edward heard that almost every night. Sometimes it came with a slap, sometimes just the words, which hurt even more than any physical blow. He grew up believing it was true, that there was something fundamentally wrong with him that made him inferior to others. At school, things were no different. Edward struggled to learn how to read. The letters got mixed up in his head, switched places, made no sense. Today, they would know he had dyslexia. Back then, teachers simply called him stupid, slow, incapable. He failed 2 grades, was humiliated in front of the class countless times, and eventually dropped out of school at 16. His father said it was for the best. "At least now you can work and pay the bills, since studying isn't something you're good for anyway." Edward silently agreed. What else could he do? The following years were a series of dead-end jobs: construction helper, truckloader, janitor, dishwasher, always the jobs no one wanted, always the lowest pay, always the first to be fired when things got tight. Edward never complained. He accepted everything with the resignation of someone who believes he doesn't deserve anything better. His bosses liked him for that. "He's quiet and does what he's told," they said. Not smart, but at least he's not trouble. Edward heard those comments and agreed with them internally. "It's true, I'm not smart. I'm only good for doing what I'm told." At 35, Edward got the job at the mechanic's shop. The owner, a rude man named Frank, hired him because he needed someone to do the dirty work: cleaning oil off the floor, washing rusted parts, organizing the messy storage room. Edward accepted without negotiating his pay. Frank paid little and treated him badly, but at least it was steady work. And Edward had already learned that people like him couldn't afford to choose. people like him had to take what came along and be grateful they weren't living on the street. The other mechanics treated Edward with indifference or contempt. To them, he was just the janitor, the invisible guy who cleaned up their mess. Sometimes they joked at his expense. "Hey, Edward, you're so useless that if they threw you in the trash would spit you back out." They laughed. Edward forced a smile and kept working. Inside, every joke was a confirmation of what he already knew. I'm useless. I'm good for nothing. That's just how things are. He was 40 years old and had already given up on expecting anything different from life. But Edward had a secret. Something he never told anyone because he was ashamed. Every night after work, he went back to his tiny room and spent hours taking apart and reassembling small devices. Broken watches, old radios, discarded fans. Things he found in the trash or bought for pennies at thrift stores. He didn't know why he did it. It had no practical use. But when his hands were busy with gears and wires, his mind was at peace. It was the only moment of the day when the voice that called him useless fell silent. On a Thursday afternoon, an imported car pulled up in front of the shop. It was an old model, a classic from the 1960s, the kind of car worth more than everything Edward would earn in 10 years of work. The owner stepped out looking desperate. He was a man in his 60s, well-dressed with grey hair, clearly someone with money. Frank, the shop owner, greeted him with a smile Edward had never seen before, the smile he saved for rich customers. The problem was the engine. The car had broken down on the road, and the owner had it towed to the nearest shop. "I need this car running by Saturday," the man said. "It's my daughter's wedding. This car belonged to my father. I promised she would arrive at the church in it." Frank assured him it would be taken care of. "Leave it with me, sir. My best mechanics will work on it." The man left the car and took a taxi, leaving a phone number and a promise to pay whatever it took. The two most experienced mechanics in the shop spent the rest of the day trying to figure out the problem. They took parts of the engine apart, tested components, checked manuals. Nothing. The car simply wouldn't start, and they couldn't understand why. On Friday, the situation was the same. Frank started to get nervous. He called other mechanics in the city asking for help. No one knew what to do. That model was too rare, too old. The parts were different, the system was different. Modern mechanics had no experience with that. Edward watched everything from a distance while sweeping the floor. He knew that model of car. He had seen pictures of it in old magazines he found in the trash. He had studied the engine in yellowed diagrams he kept in a folder under his bed. He didn't know why he was interested in it. It was just another one of his useless obsessions, like taking apart broken watches. But as he watched the mechanics work, he noticed something. They were looking in the wrong place. The problem wasn't in the main engine, it was in a secondary component that no longer existed in modern cars. Edward hesitated. Who was he to say anything? He was just the janitor, the guy who cleaned oil off the floor. If he opened his mouth, they would laugh at him like they always did. They would tell him to shut up and go back to sweeping. But then he thought about the grey-haired man, about the daughter who was getting married, about the promise to arrive at the church in her grandfather's car, and something inside him moved, a small courage, almost invisible, that he didn't know still existed. He approached Frank at the end of the day, when the other mechanics had already left, frustrated. "Mr. Frank," he said in a low voice, "I think I know what the problem is." Frank looked at him as if a dog had started talking. "What? You?" Edward felt his face burn with shame, but he kept going. "It's the original voltage regulator. These old cars had a different system. If the regulator fails, the car won't start, but it looks like an engine problem." Frank was silent for a moment. Then he laughed. "Edward, you're a janitor. You can barely read. Go back to sweeping the floor and leave the real work to people who know what they're doing." Edward lowered his head and left. Of course it had gone that way. What had he expected? That suddenly his words would have value, that someone would listen to him. He was useless. He always had been. He always would be. That night he couldn't sleep. He lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the car, the wedding, the daughter who wouldn't arrive at the church the way her father had promised, and thinking about himself. About 40 years of being treated like nothing, about 40 years of believing he deserved it. At 3 in the morning, Edward made a decision. He got out of bed, put on his work clothes, and went to the shop. He had a copy of the key because sometimes he needed to open early to receive deliveries. He entered quietly, turned on only a dim light, and walked over to the imported car. His hands were shaking, not with fear, but with something he hadn't felt in a long time. Determination. He opened the hood and began to work. If he was wrong, he would lose his job. But if he was right, maybe, just maybe, he could prove that he wasn't so useless after all. Edward worked through the entire night. His hands, accustomed to taking apart watches and old radios, moved with a precision he himself didn't know he had. He removed the original voltage regulator and examined every connection, every wire, every component. He was right. The regulator had burned out exactly as he suspected. The problem was that the part no longer existed. It hadn't been manufactured for decades. Any mechanic would have given up right there. But Edward wasn't just any mechanic. Edward was the man who spent his nights rebuilding things everyone else threw away. He ran back to his room at the boarding house. Under the bed, in cardboard boxes organized by size, were years' worth of collected parts. Watches, radios, fans, old televisions, things people discarded, which he rescued from the trash as if they were treasures. He knew exactly what he was looking for. A car radio from the 1950s he had found at a thrift store for $2. Inside it was a voltage regulator that, with a few adjustments, could work. Edward grabbed the part and returned to the shop before sunrise. At 6 in the morning, when Frank arrived to open the shop, he found Edward sitting on the floor next to the car, covered in grease, exhausted but smiling. "What the hell are you doing here?" Frank asked, furious. Edward didn't answer. He simply stood up, walked to the driver's seat, and turned the key. The engine roared, strong and perfect, as if it had never had a problem at all. Frank froze. The other mechanics, arriving at that moment, stopped in the doorway, unable to believe what they were seeing. The janitor had fixed what none of them could. The car's owner arrived an hour later, summoned by a phone call from Frank. When he heard the engine running, his eyes filled with tears. He hugged Frank, thanking him profusely. Frank accepted the hug and the praise without correcting anything. But the man noticed Edward standing in the corner, still covered in grease, and asked who he was. Before Frank could answer, one of the mechanics spoke up. "He fixed it. He worked all night. None of us could do it, but he did." The man walked up to Edward and held out his hand. "What's your name?" "Edward, sir." "Edward, you saved my daughter's wedding. How can I thank you?" Edward didn't know what to say. No one had ever asked his name like that. No one had ever shaken his hand with gratitude. He stood there in silence, feeling something strange in his chest, something it took him a moment to recognize, because he hadn't felt it in decades. Pride. The man pulled a card from his pocket and handed it to Edward. "My name is Richard Coleman. I own a classic car restoration company in Detroit. I've been looking for someone with your skills for years. If you want a real job, call me." Edward looked at the card, then at Frank, then at the mechanics who had spent years calling him useless. None of them could meet his eyes. 2 months later, Edward was in Detroit. Richard had kept his promise. He gave Edward a job as a classic car restorer, with a salary 5 times higher than what he earned at the shop. More important than the money, he gave Edward something he had never had before: respect. His co-workers treated him as an equal. They asked for his opinion. They valued his knowledge. Edward discovered that everything he thought was useless, The dismantled watches, the rebuilt radios, the nights spent studying diagrams of old engines had value. He had simply been in the wrong place, surrounded by the wrong people. At 45, Edward became the company's leading expert in classic cars. At 50, he opened his own specialized shop. Clients came from other states to have their cars restored by him. Industry magazines published articles about his work. The boy, who had been called useless his entire life, was now called a master. And every time someone asked how he had come so far, Edward told the story of the broken car and the night he decided to prove his worth, not to others, but to himself. My friend, Edward's story is proof that a person's value is not defined by what others say about them. It is defined by what they do when no one is watching. Edward spent 40 years believing he was useless because ignorant people repeated it until he accepted it as truth. But the truth was different. He always had talent. He always had value. He just needed a chance to show it. And when the chance came, he was ready because he never stopped learning, even when no one believed in him. If this story touched you in any way, leave a like now. That simple gesture helps more people find this message when they need it most. Leave a comment sharing something you do that the world hasn't recognized yet. And if you know someone who feels useless, someone the world is underestimating, share this video with them. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this every week. And remember, you are not what others say you are. You are what you build in silence while they are not looking. Your value exists. Maybe it's time to finally show it to the world.